Okay, as people are joining, just a couple of housekeeping tips. Again, if you could please put yourself on mute, and if you could please disable your camera, that would be great if you're not speaking. Okay. Well, it is 11:04 here, so I'm going to give it another minute. Okay. All right, well, let me go ahead and get started here. Let me welcome everybody here to this webinar as we talk about code switching in the workplace. My name is Jason Wright. I'm the VP of Communications for NHHR Chicago. For those who don't know about NHHR, it is a professional organization, a global organization, where we provide both professional development and networking opportunities for African Americans in human resources. I'm going to include a link here that talks a little bit more about the local chapter here in Chicago. But without further ado, I want to highlight we couldn't do anything without our sponsors. So I want to highlight our sponsor for today's event, Navistar. So we really appreciate Navistar sponsoring this event. And I'd like to bring on Donna Dorsey, who is the Chief Human Resource Officer for Navistar. She's going to say a few things before we get started. Donna?
Thanks so much. It's an honor for Navistar to sponsor this program. We have several of our esteemed colleagues participating in the program, but I think it's important that we do this topic, that we talk about this so that we can help each other as we navigate the world, but also navigate the workplace. So I don't want to talk too long. I'm interested in the conversation. I know there'll be a lot of dialogue, and I'm seeing the chat already starting, so let's keep that up. And thank you again for allowing us to sponsor this program and to participate.
All right, thanks, Donna. So my name is Kelly Weaver, and I'll be your moderator today for this topic. And I am also from Navistar, and we are very proud to sponsor and also host this discussion today. So please post questions in the chat. We will get to those throughout and at the end. But before we get started, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists today. And so we have Troy McIntosh. She is from US Cellular. We've got Meredith Morales. She is from LinkedIn. Hi. And then we've also got Nicole Wiggins. She is from Navistar. And they are all diversity and inclusion officers for their organizations, and so are very prepared to talk with us about, let's talk about what today is. It is just really exploring this topic. While we are not offering solutions necessarily, it's thought-provoking, and we are offering tools for your consideration to take back to your workplace as HR professionals or otherwise. And so all in the pursuit to advance this topic. So with that, I'll head to the panelists here. And so do you all know what code switching is? Yeah. Troy, you're on mute. Nicole, you're on mute. So I'm going to start by just doing some level setting here and telling our audience what the formal definition is. And then we're going to get into what we think about it. And so it is known as the practice of interacting in different ways, depending on the social context. It's not limited to race. Most of us interact differently when hanging out with friends or going to work or an interview. And so it means different things to different people. So linguistically, for African Americans, of which we will focus on specifically today, in this form, it usually means making ourselves come off as a little less threatening using what some call our white voices. It's the way we use inflection and tone, and also how we express ourselves through mannerisms and hair, things like that. So with that, Nicole, I'd like to head to you for our first question. And so do you feel like this is something, code switching, that you have to do in your everyday life?
Yeah. So in short,
Yeah.
yes. I know we
So?
had a couple, I'm looking at the chat too, and people are saying, yep, every day, all day. So yeah, I think it is a way of, unfortunately, survival. So, as we talk about the workplace, reading the room and, making sure that you are saying the right words or speaking the right way. Right now, we want to make sure we don't say something out of line. Troy might when he started saying something, but uh, as far as just trying to make sure people are comfortable with you, that's something that I think that I have to do every day. And sometimes I have to shift how I speak in order to do so. Or, and I won't go into too much detail because I'm allow for the other panelists to speak on this, but even the way I wear my hair, right? I just recently changed it and got braids, and that sometimes sparks additional conversation as, oh my God, you got a haircut, that kind of stuff. And then you're like, okay, is this appropriate for work? Right. So as we talk about code switching in the workplace, what do you have to do in order where the way you dress, the way you talk, how you interact with certain people. I think you may show a video later on just to show like how people interact differently, just depending on who they're interacting with. But yes, definitely something I feel like I have to do every day, depending, from meeting to meeting. Unfortunately, whoever you're comfortable with or whoever you have to be more formal with, you have to shift how you speak and switch.
Troy, how about you?
Yeah, so it's contextual. It's very contextual. So I will say I noticed it more. I probably was doing it all the time, but my boss now, the head of HR at US Cellular, is Black, and I notice it less because I actually noticed it sometimes in the reversal. I remember when I first started working on this team. So my peers, actually now I have 2 African American peers, a Black boss, and 3 white peers, right? And when I first started working for my Black boss, we'd be at meetings and there would be jokes that would be shared that the white people didn't get. That was really different for me, like to have a boss that would say something, kind of look and say, you know what I'm saying? Like would do something subtly Black. I was like, I could just kind of relax, so that was really different. But yeah, it's definitely contextual. And I would say I'm having the experience of having an African American woman as my boss, and I'm recognizing it more because I'm recognizing the settings where I'm not as focused on code switching.
Yeah, I would just plus one to that. So, I was thinking, I was seeing in the chat, and I love the engagement everyone has on this. So there's an individual in the chat who called out that their 8-year-old daughter has already started this conversation. And so I know we're talking a lot about it in the workplace, and rightly so, but, for me, personally, I've been thinking a lot about this, and code switching is something I've been doing my entire life. And I'll just be completely transparent. So most of you on this call don't know that I used to work with Troy, and Troy was actually the first Black boss I've had. And he actually called me out on code switching. And it wasn't until I worked for him that I actually understood that there was a term. Like, I knew it was happening, but it really is a difference. It's truly contextual to the environment, who you work for, your level of comfort in terms of how you show up and the way that you show up. And if you feel that psychological safety to show up as your authentic self.
Yeah, for those individuals on the call who, again, today we're talking about the African American or brown person experience, it through a lens where we're not the standard. You know, we are in a room with many other people who do not look like us, right? And so I think the come from is, how do you navigate this water? You know, you've got this different complexion with, you know, we're not post race right now. Things are not post racial. So we're still dealing with this. And even if it's not a thought of everyone else in the room, it's on our minds. And in fact, when I talked with Nicole in preparation for this call, we were just talking about working from home. You know, she said, it's a weight lifted to not have to go into the meetings right now. And again, because you want to express yourself through hair, you know, she wanted to change her hairstyle, but when the meeting's over, it's over. You don't have to feel like you're being watched coming and going. And it's just a feeling. Whether it is a thing or not, it's a thing to us. So for her, it's a de-stressor to be able to work from home right now. It's just one less thing to worry about, right? And so with that, I think, Troy, for you, the next question. So do you think that, given where there are some people that say, what you see is what you get, you know, I don't code switch, I'm not changing for anybody. You know, is it important to be effective at this code switching thing at work? And if you're not doing it, you missed opportunities.
You mean like when keeping it real goes wrong, something like that? Like,
Yeah, you're right.
So,
It smells like something.
so I will say this: we have, you know, is it important? I will say that it's a constant struggle for me. I'm involved with, so I'm in a professional role. It's a constant struggle on at least 3 levels. One, individually, to what extent do I want to bend, right? Myself, what are my limits? Because I have some, there's some things I'm just not gonna do. And in retrospect, you know, we use some of these terms interchangeably, like at US, I guess in the D&I world, we talk about code switching, which maybe deals with kind of like linguistics and whatever the corporate world views as being professional. We actually use the IDI, which is an assessment that looks at cultural competence. And there's a term in there, some might know it, but maybe the term would be minimization non-dominance, like when you're not in the dominant role and you minimize your own cultural differences to manage. We've introduced Kinji Yoshino has popularized the term covering, right? Where I could be minimizing my authentic self. So individually, I'm managing it myself. That's the first thing. And then I'm also wondering, to what extent do I actually share feedback that I hear or feedback that I recognize with my Black associates? To what extent do I tell them that? And I will say it's a struggle, because I'm always wondering, you know, if I give you this feedback, is that going to crush you? Is that like your authentic self? You know, is that maybe the feedback may deal with how you pronounce a word. I'm just being really, it might deal with pronunciation. It may deal with, you know, things that I think for other people from other cultures, they don't get that feedback. They sometimes maybe sometimes they do, by the way, but so I would say it's a constant day-to-day evaluating all these things, right? To what extent am I going to say something that will hurt somebody, authentic, you know, their selves? I'm considering that. But I also would say people deserve to hear that kind of feedback. And the last thing I will say is that sometimes the feedback is not authentic, because it's just an excuse, right? For why you don't want to promote this person or why you don't want to, it's not real. So, man, is it important? I'm going to have to say yes, because we're dealing with navigating a business culture where we're not the majority. So yes, I'm just gonna give it a yes. Yeah.
It's a yes for me. Yeah.
To the extent to which you want to roll in this game, Yes. Yep.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Troy. So I'd like to throw this to Donna, actually. So Donna, do you feel like if a person chooses not to quote unquote or per se code switch, are there missed opportunities there for the individual professionally?
I think it depends on your environment. That's my own personal opinion. So, those who know me know that I have a hard time always remembering that I'm supposed to code switch. And things come out in ways that maybe aren't comfortable. Like Troy, to your point, I can see Deirdre saying some things that you would think no one else will get what she's talking about but me. But I do think that there is a perception in the workplace that that we have the burden of overcoming, and sometimes you want to put yourself in a position where you're not having to overcome that burden, and you have to figure out what you're going to do and how you're going to say it. So if Nicole wants to switch her hair to braids, cool, that's fine. I think some things are just more difficult to overcome. So yeah, it happens, but I think you have to just be very aware of your environment.
Thank you.
I just want to add that I think that I would plus one to that, Donna. I think that there is a cost to code switching, right? To not code switching, to Troy's point. We're at an inflection point where companies are still trying to understand how to be diverse and inclusive and make people feel like they belong. And so, at this time, it causes more of the ability to show up as your authentic self. But when we were all in person, right, if you made the choice to not show up and wear your hair how you want to wear it, and not kind of assimilate to the culture, they tell you, oh, bring your authentic self to work, we want to see who you are. But it was like a trick, right? I often thought of it as like the Clark Kent syndrome, right? Like they're telling me to show up as Supergirl, but really if I did, it would be too much. And then when the doors close and they're talking about those promotion decisions, and they're people are sitting together at lunch and they're getting invited to the happy hours, it's truly a mechanism that can decide if you're going to thrive and be promoted in your career, if you're going to feel included and feel like you belong. And there's this expectation of adaptation to white culture, particularly in corporate. But I think in this movement that we're seeing of Black Lives Matter, it becomes even more relevant, because the choice to not code switch, we now see, can often make the difference between life and death, right? So when we think about some of these horrendous stories, right, of Black males being pulled over by police officers, Black females, right? If they didn't code switch in those moments, right? Like if a cop pulls me over, I immediately go into the I'm speaking a certain way. I'm sure I'm very mindful of my mannerisms. But if individuals weren't taught or didn't learn to adapt to these things, it could literally cost them their life, because a cop could feel life threatened by a simple like neck roll, right? Or the pronunciation of a word. And so I really feel like it's more important than ever, until the world gets this right and truly is inclusive, to make the choice of adaptation and to code switch when you don't have the safety to choose otherwise.
Yeah. No, that is an excellent point. There's a couple of notes here that I want to make sure that we go over, like mannerisms, because there is such a thing as Black expression, as there is with many other, race, color, creeds, or, gender, identity. So I think let's get into a little bit about this Black expression for a moment. And so there are a variety of different stereotypes, but as you talk about Meredith, and if you don't mind, I will just sort of go off of what you said. Is code switching a survival tactic? And I think what I'll do is throw this over to Troy. When you talk about the social injustice or things that we're all seeing on the news right now, so Troy, do you feel like code switching for African Americans in particular is a survival tactic?
Yes, I think it could. I think it could be. So, I mean, this is gonna like this is sounding like I agree with this. I don't I don't really think it's good, right? I think it's a shame, right? But yeah, and that's why I think it's actually even more important to kind of know who you are. I'll give you another corporate example. You know, sometimes I get brought in, and the kind of roles I've been involved with in talent or, you know, OD or diversity. One time I got a call from a leader from a call center, and they were describing how they were struggling giving performance feedback to people, right? And they were describing, well, you know, these people, you know, they talk louder, and they talk a certain way on the phone, and we're getting complaints, you know. And I was kind of listening for a while. First, I was like, okay. So then I was like, so, okay. So, but why are you calling me, right? Why? I don't work in the call center. So at some point I was like, are you talking about Black women? They're like, yeah, Troy, like, yeah. Or,
Like, I knew I could talk to you. I knew I could talk to you.
and they said, you know, whenever we talk to them, they keep saying, this is how we talk. This is just how we this is just how we talk. I was like, so in that situation, my pushback was, you know, can we review the recording? They're like, well, we haven't recorded it. You know, do you have any actual performance? You know, are their customer service numbers lower? They're like, you know, so they were like, you know what? Yeah, we need to go look at the data. But I know what's going on there, right? This is coming up as a performance issue. I describe it, you know, in two different ways. When I'm engaging, you know, with majority culture, my responsibility is to ensure majority culture has fact-based feedback, actually links this to performance outcomes, things like that. My responsibility is to check the bias and make sure that if it's just a issue of preference, that it doesn't affect that person's career. And then on the flip side, when I'm dealing with people of difference, mainly when I'm dealing with Black folks, my coaching is typically like, this could be something that takes something off of the, that actually can get rid of a disqualifier for you. This could, I can't guarantee it, but typically the more senior you become, it's not really about whether or not you are qualified, it's about how you get disqualified, and if there's a way we could help you to not disqualify. So I find myself having two different conversations, right? Depending on who I'm dealing with.
Yeah. All right. And I think what Troy is describing is, again, that standard in the workplace. And it is, you know, a balance between being professional and being your authentic self. And so, Nicole, is there anything that you would like to offer up there in terms of just, you know, navigating the corporate walk, in terms of, is it a requirement? Is this a survival tactic? Do you
Yes and yes.
do it? If you didn't do it, then you won't meet the standard, you know, the voice inflection and things like that.
Yeah, I really think it is. And I think I know personally, sometimes I even struggle with, you code switch at what cost, right? Is it at the cost of losing yourself? You know, being your authentic self? You know, because earlier in my career, you know, you watch people and how they act and those that are being promoted, and you're like, okay, I have to act this way in order to be considered, because it goes to that whole fit in. And as Troy was talking about, you know, the biases, right? So we will sometimes disqualify candidates because we'll say that they don't, like a hiring manager will say, well, they won't fit in. And what exactly does that mean? Right? I had a situation, it's like, you know, I joke and say I'm an HR transplant because I came from the business, but where I had an employee and he was actually a Latino descent, and the previous leader was like, it's just something about him. And he wouldn't go into what it meant, you know, and I knew exactly what he was talking about, but I wanted him to tell me, you know, I wanted him to say, you know, I'm not comfortable with him. His accent's so strong. I don't understand what he's saying. You know, so why, but they, you know, you feel like you have to assimilate and certain things, like especially ESL, you know, English second language, what are you telling these people they have to learn how to speak differently altogether? You know, he's speaking English, you know, and speaking specifically about, you know, Black people and excuse me, as Troy had mentioned with the Black women, I had a situation like that too, where I had a Black woman on my team who she didn't necessarily speak proper English all the time, proper English, right? But but she was very talented. You know, she was a very talented individual, and but she, you know, sometimes she would say words the wrong way, or she would use the wrong word in the wrong context. You know, but and part of it was because she was trying to code switch to say something that she may not even have clearly understood using the words incorrectly, but she thought that she needed to do that in order to impress them, which unfortunately in that situation, it kind of went the other way. So like, what is she talking about? But yeah, I do definitely think it's a survival skill, you know, and not everyone knows how to do it, right? If you think, or even knows what it is. I know during one of the prep meetings, right, Meredith, we were talking about it, and I know you mentioned you learned about it, you know, with working with Troy. And even though the term is relatively new over the last several years, this is something I think a lot of us, as the lady mentioned in the chat, her 8-year-old, my 15-year-old. I was watching YouTube's, you know, kind of just, you know, about code switching. And she's like, Mom, why are you watching that? You know all about it. You do it all day. You know, you think, and you don't even realize that sometimes you don't even realize you're doing it when you do it so much.
Yeah,
I just want
But
to
yeah, definitely a survival tactic.
absolutely.
I just want to double click on that quickly. So really well said, Nicole. And I would just add, you know, when we think about survival, right, we talked about the Black Lives Matter, where it's literally, right, a survival from life and death. When we think about in the corporations, right, so I think most of us are familiar with the statistic that Black women are currently the most educated in the US. But if I were to ask you how many of us have Black female bosses, shout out to Donna, but how many of us have Black female bosses, right? Right, like the hands would likely not go up, right? We are not equally represented at the levels that match our education, and it doesn't take anything away from Black males, but you know, when you think about underrepresented groups, you know, we're highly educated, we're highly performing, and that's not reflected when you look at the number of CEOs, leaders of color, you know, across the diaspora. The other thing I wanted to cite is, you know, we're talking a lot about cultural fit. So I have the privilege of working at LinkedIn, and at LinkedIn we talk about culture ad. And I think that, you know, a lot of this, and we talked about this in our prep call, is you know, it varies by industry. So before I got into tech, you know, I had like what I called in my head the uniform, right? Like I had the suit, and I had like, you know, the pearl necklace, and I had the fancy handbag. And, you know, these are the things that I wore because people are, you know, bias comes into play before you even open your mouth, right? A lot of assumptions are being made on where you grew up and how they think you're going to sound. And, you know, just having a racially ambiguous name, right? Of Meredith, right? Like they had a whole different, I like to shock people when I picked up the phone and they're like, oh, you sound like, well, what were you expecting? Right. And so it's, I think companies really need to get better at understanding the importance of culture ad, because the expectation that people will continue to adapt and code switch really threatens what diversity truly is about. Right? You can't say you're about diversity and inclusion and carry this expectation that individuals will, you know, adapt to your culture, which is basically very much akin to white culture being bolted, and diversity is kind of like bolted on. And so, you know, I think companies really need to adapt, and the industry that you're in is something else that you should take a look at if you find that you're code switching more than you're, you know, than you may have been in the past.
All right, thank you, Meredith. You know, in some of the research that we did preparing for this topic, you know, I couldn't help but notice that there are, you know, a lot of different groups that are impacted by this notion of having to switch it up, be situational, depending on your forum. And so, but again, while specifically focusing here on Black and Brown, you know, I am going to reference something I found about vernacular and systems by which people speak. And so English in America is the standard. But then there's a lot of other people now in the United States who bring their culture with them. And so Nicole speaks about the Hispanic individual that shows up to work, but because who knows their background? We all have a background. But let's just say English is not first language. So now having to adapt to the standard, and it's a conundrum to know whether the standard is just being professional or is the standard being talking white? Or, is it the standard based on the culture in which I work? Not all cultures are the same. And so you can see where this thing has tentacles, right? There is no right or wrong answer. We're exploring here, why do people feel like it's a requirement to fit? And so when we talk about speaking and vernacular, I found it so interesting that, there was a very popular trial that happened. And while we're not experts here, from our reading, one of the Black Lives Matter trials very early on was Trayvon Martin. And so one of the star witnesses, Rachel Zentel, she was the star witness, but because her system of vernacular did not match the standard of US English, she was discredited. And although what she offered to the jury may have been fact-based because she was on the phone with him around and during the incident, the officer walked free. So right, wrong, or indifferent, the verdict hung on that star witness, but because of the African-American experiences that she brought with her and that vernacular and the Black expression, right, wrong, or indifferent, it discredited her. And so she was on Good Morning America. There was a lot of buzz around that some of us may not remember, but it is an interesting topic that there are different systems by which people speak. Doesn't make it right or wrong, but it's not known as whatever people have made up to be as the standard. And so with that, I think I'd like to go to the chat and see if we have any questions. And so is it Caitlin that's going to offer us some chat questions?
Yes, hello, how are you?
Hi, Caitlin, how are you?
I'm doing well. So,
Oh, good to hear from you. Okay, do we have any questions?
yeah, we've had a few.
Okay.
The community where you are the majority in the organization, and how do you go about code switching, say, like in an opposite sense?
You cut out for the first part. Could you repeat the first part of that question, please, for our panelists?
Sure. So the question's along the lines of what changes when you are the majority in an organization, and how would it work if, say, it's an opposite type of situation happening? Is anything different?
Interesting. I think Troy can take this one, and Nicole. They are both on teams that are populated largely more by African Americans. So who would like to start? Nicole?
I just had an interruption, Troy, so if you don't mind starting.
I have that same type of interruption.
Yeah, so it's the constant shifting back and forth between different cultural settings, right? So in a given day, I might engage with my family. I may engage with the broader US culture, US cellular culture, which is predominantly white, with my own team, which is a mixture of people, but is more diverse. And then as another example, maybe with my church, right? Let's just throw that out there, right? And so you have different settings. And so out of those three settings, two of those would be a little bit more natural for me, and one would be a little bit more thinking. And I think the thing we haven't talked a lot about code switching is that while it could be helpful in some respect, it is also psychologically and intellectually taxing, because rather than simply communicate, you're thinking about how you're going to communicate, and you're thinking probably more than most how your communication will be perceived.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it's very difficult. So I do lead a team where there are times, right, that kind of I may need to step in and ensure that the people on the team who are not people of color, right, are heard. Like I'm committed to that work no matter who is at the table, right? I'm committed to it. So that doesn't happen a lot on my team because we tend to be respectful, but it could happen, right? I mean, I have a team of people. The majority of people on my team are people of color, and so as a matter of fact, the majority are Black, right? So those folks who report to me. So yeah, so but being in the majority is actually pretty rare, and in the corporate setting, there's still the overarching expectation that you have that right. My team exists in a power structure, in a system that is still led by majority culture. So we're still having to meet those expectations and standards. So I'm not really in that situation. I mean, maybe if for example, I'm looking forward to going to Africa. I'm looking forward to going to Africa, spending some time in Africa, because I've really never spent a long period of time in a culture that's predominantly Black, right? So to answer that question at a certain level, I mean, I could answer it for maybe like my church, but it's not really my experience in the business world to be racial.
Yeah. Yeah. Nicole, are you good now?
Yeah, I'm better.
Okay.
That's the one disadvantage sometimes. The dogs start going crazy. Yeah, so as far as the opposite, in terms of so Kelly said I can answer this question. So I work on Donna's team. Not the first time I've had a Black boss, but I will say the first time in a long time. And by working for her, one, she's just really a good person. And I'm not just saying that because she's on the call, but she helps you to feel comfortable and provides the level of support so that you need to be successful in this type of role. Honestly, I sometimes, because I've only been in the D&I space, 18 months, sometimes I wonder if Navistar would be as far on the journey if she wasn't in her role, right? So if you talk about the majority, similar to what Troy just said, as far as it's the majority within her team, but it's more like a 60-40 thing, you know what I mean? So do we still have a lot of work to do? Absolutely. I mean, the company in general, overall is still, predominantly white male. I mean, honestly, just as far as the industry that we work in, right, that we exist in. So it is sometimes challenging for others who are not impacted, because I do a bias training for our organization, but those that are not impacted to really clearly understand the challenges, right? You don't want to be pulling a race car, but specifically to answer the question that Caitlin said, when you're the majority, I think it's probably mostly a shout out to our Black Employee Resource Group. Yes, there is a certain comfort level that you have, right? So do you have to switch again? I am, and check those that know me, check me if this is incorrect, but I feel like I am who I am, whether I'm talking to them or talking to others, because I don't know, I think maybe I code switched a lot more when I was a little more entry level, I guess I'll say. But now I'm like, this is me. I want to be my authentic self. I am this. I don't think I could make progress if I wasn't me. Right? Because you can only speak from your experiences, and it's exhausting if you have to continue to switch back and forth.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, you know, while I don't have all the answers, I do feel like in the situation where you're in a majority group, you have to just be yourself, right? You
Yeah.
want, and that's the D&I journey, right? You want people to be able to bring their authentic self to work.
Right.
So,
Right.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I have an authentic, just something that I have an interesting kind of unique perspective. So I actually worked for an investment firm that was predominantly Black, right? I was trying to think of the right words to use without naming the firm. And so, you know, so to answer your question is an interesting one, because in that instance, you know, we were the majority in terms of like visually, right? In terms of how we identify as individuals of the Black community. But that, you know, the code switching continued. Because there's different things that come into play. And I think it really comes down to what Nicole was saying. It's environmental. It goes back down to the psychological. It's not a numbers game. It's not like, oh, there are more people that look like me here, so therefore I feel like I can show up this way. It really comes down to, no matter like what circles you're in, who you are, and you know, the circles that you feel most comfortable with, right? I report to an amazing Latina woman right now, and like, you know, I don't have to code switch, right? Like I'm out there, and it's great, you know. And I feel like, again, it comes down to psychological safety, environmental, right? What's your experience and what's your relationship? Is the company signaling that you can be yourself every day, or are they signaling, kind of like when I worked at Troy, that I could be myself in those moments with Troy on his team, but then had to revert to my other self in, you know, in the broader organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, good perspective. I think now we'll pause on chat. We will come back to that. So please keep the questions coming. We're reserving time at the end to make sure that we answer those things. But Eric, do you have the video?
Yeah, give me 1 second, okay?
All right. He's
All
going
right.
to show us an interesting video, you guys, that actually Roderick, the president of Interpolation, shared with me. And while there are many examples out there, this is a short clip and really fits in with our dialogue today.
Okay, can you guys see my screen now? Can you see the video?
Yes.
Okay, here we
Thank
go.
you. Yes.
Here we go.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Eric.
No problem.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so that video was what, 20 seconds long or so. And before this woman made it to the coffee machine across the cafeteria floor, we watched her demonstrate code switching. She spoke Hispanic to the person across the room. She met an African-American, what we call, you know, a sister in the workplace, and they did their exchange of, you know, greetings. And then she also ran into a white coworker, and it was like, good morning, how are you? And then she saw a brown colored man in there that she might have thought was attractive. And she's like, oh, hey, you know, how you flirt with people. So, you know, again, we don't have the answers, but this is very exemplary of like sort of what we do in the workplace or otherwise. And so I think let's just take a moment to kind of dissect what we saw. And so I'm going to start with Meredith here. I guess, what is your general thought on what we just shared with the audience?
Yeah, I absolutely love that video for so many reasons. I think it is really reflective of how a lot of us spend the day, whether or not we're speaking actual different languages, but how we communicate, right? And I think it's so important because the way that she was going about it really resonated with me because there's a side of this where sometimes we code switch to feel comfortable, to adapt, and to survive. Sometimes it's a practice of cultural humility, right? And so sometimes when I'm around colleagues from other cultures, I find myself trying to engage in code switch, right? Not for adaptation, but because I'm curious, right? And I'm interested, and I'm not interested. I'm less interested in showing how different I am, and more interested in kind of understanding their practices, which can be, in my mind, that's the equivalent of her, saying something in Spanish. So I love it. I think, at the end of the day, people are a kaleidoscope, right? We're never all one thing. And I think as long as the way you're showing up, no matter how different it is in different settings, as long as it feels comfortable and safe, then that's really what there should be the primary focus on.
Yeah. All right. Absolutely. Thank you. So Troy, I guess, what are your thoughts on what you just saw in that video?
Well, so I'll kind of add to what Meredith said. I mean, at US Cellular, we have, for the past 4 years, we've had a focus on building cultural competence. So if we were to flip this, right, and I were to go back to what I've heard some other folks say, Meredith, others, and we were to think about even going beyond code switching and thinking about cultural competence, like I said, we've assessed our leaders, most of our senior leaders actually working above using the IDI, which is an assessment that looks at cultural competence. And if we were to say, let's talk about your ability, let's talk about cultural dexterity. Let's talk about your ability to actually adapt as a positive thing you may bring to the organization. This is extremely important if your organization is international, right? The ability to recognize cultural difference, adapt your behavior, and we realize some people don't have it.
Yeah.
Is it always the case that code switching goes along with cultural competence? Maybe not, but the openness to it is really there. So another way we could think about this dialogue is, how do people who have been culturally sensitive, but focused on cultural difference their whole life, how do they have a head start at understanding people that are different? And how do we leverage their ability to do those things in a world that's becoming increasingly global and diverse? Like that's another way to talk about it. So rather than think about it only in terms of, is this something we have to do? Is it a African-American superpower? Is it something that we could get better at and leverage, right, in a global, more diverse world, and help our organizations to understand how their language, how their marketing engage people of difference? So maybe that's a different way to think. So I love the video too, especially when she's like, "Hey, black." I think it just cracks me. I'm like, because I see myself sometimes walking, it's like, "What up, black man?"
Right.
That's how I'm like, I just think it's humorous and fun. So I love that vid. I think it's really cool.
Well, yeah, and I'd like to get Nicole's just thought on what she thinks. She and I watched it together, but I think, Troy, you hit on something. I mean, this is how it is. When you see, and I'm going to make up names, when I see, a Black woman at work, it may or may not be, depending on my relationship with her. If it's somebody I'm really cool with, it's gonna be like, "Hey, what's up, girl? How you doing?" That's not really me, but joking around, you might say, you probably wouldn't say that to your best friend, white coworker. It's gonna be like, "Hey, how are you today? That's so great." Again, that is me all day long, but at the same time, you switch it up. And so what we saw in the video, that's not a joke. I mean, that really is. She spoke Spanish. I don't speak Spanish. So I wouldn't have been able to do that. But still, it's just such a difference in how you greet people, and make them feel comfortable. We're all trying to disarm people and be approachable in our own way most of the time. But Nicole, let's get your thought on what we saw, and then we'll go back to the chat.
Okay, that works.
Okay.
So both Meredith and Troy hit on some very great points, but if I were to add anything, it would be, so I have my team, my direct team staff currently, I have an opening. If anyone's interested, but also I do have Asian American woman as well as a white woman, Polish American woman who works on my team. And we worked together for several years and we're extremely comfortable. And I can say, what's up, girl, kind of thing to them, or we talk very casually, but it's based on my comfort level. Because at that point, it doesn't have a whole lot to do with race, right? And for at least we've overcome that, which is interesting when other people see us interacting. I think it's surprising. And because they don't expect the Black woman, the Asian woman, and the white woman to have this type of relationship. And Donna's administrative assistant, she's Latino, she's Mexican. And, she's working on helping me learn how to speak Spanish better, so it's just
Nice.
a matter of who you're, how comfortable you are. I mean, the video is it really depicts, like, depending on who she interacted with, she responded differently, she greeted them differently, but it was based on her relationship with these people, right? And that's one thing I did want to hit on is just being authentic. Because as Troy talked about how you market and things, I know I cringe sometimes when I see ads or something where you could tell they're trying a little too hard to market to certain demographics and it's not authentic. Right. So it has to be authentic or people just, I know personally, I don't buy into it because I'm like, are you really doing that? Some commercials you see, you just are like, okay, that they're trying. And you kind of respond that way, like, okay, they tried it. Kind of.
Right.
So yeah, I think it just shows, like, just depending on your relationship and your comfort level, how we have to continue to switch or want to switch too, because it feels good sometimes too to be able to do so.
Yeah. I think Troy hit on something good that we should not lose sight of. We are turning into a more global, environment. The world is just this huge melting pot. And so I think what we're seeing in the video is representation of what Nicole brings up. This individual was super authentic. Obviously, it's based on her relationship with the people, on her walk to the coffee maker. But at the same time, while I admit, I don't speak Spanish, Nicole is trying to learn Spanish. I mean, there's going to be a time where, even though I speak the standard, you're going to have to be able to adapt. And almost just like people come here and they speak 2 or 3 languages because they need to assimilate. When will that be an expectation or a survival tactic for many of us, not just Black and brown, but for leaders to be able to navigate their global, teams and things like that and to run companies. But okay, before we go to chat, I think we should also address, Nicole, your thought on authenticity. So I'm going to bring this question up for the panelists. Is code switching being fake? Is it not being your authentic self? Because do you or do you not sometimes feel when you go home at the end of the day that you've been sent your representative to work? You've been a good actor or an actress all day, and maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
So who would like to start off with that? I guess Meredith, let's start with you.
Sure, that's an excellent question. I've been thinking a lot about this, and I don't think it's fake, but again, it's situational, right? So in some instances, right, like, do I in my day to day before my current my current job at LinkedIn, like, did I go into, some of these corporate offices in finance wearing like jeans and a shirt, right? Like and a t-shirt, right? And ripped jeans and, even on like casual Fridays would be like a no-no. So yeah, like in those respects, yes, it was fake. And I once got some feedback that stayed with me around someone felt like they just didn't know who I was because I was always so buttoned up. But you know, that was me feeling like that was the way I had to operate because this is not my normal self. Versus like I get to LinkedIn and tech, and again, it comes down to industries, right? So tech is much more like low key. And like I come in and it's like ripped jeans and it's sneakers and it's okay to have tattoos and I dyed my hair red. Like, you know, it's all about like the fakeness is just a different version of survival, right? And again, coming back to that comfort. Do you feel comfortable enough to be real, right?
Yeah.
Or are you not comfortable enough so you default to being the version of yourself that you feel like the company or that situation is expecting?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Troy, how about you?
I just keep thinking about that Chappelle skit, you know, like when keeping it real goes wrong. I keep it real, you know, like so this is all about.
I've seen that one.
This-
I don't know. I've seen that one.
Okay.
That's all of us in our heads
I
sometimes.
think that is the best example is, you know, because right. So this is all a matter of degrees, right? And to what extent, you know, I like what Meredith said about like the company said that we want you to bring your authentic self, but it was just a big trick. You know, like now we see how, like okay,
Right.
Like,
Right.
people taking
Yeah.
notes, you know. So
Yeah, you will be graded on it later. Yeah. Yeah.
okay, I saw.
Yeah.
Uh,
Please,
uh,
please be yourself.
right. but I'm actually just joking. It's a matter of degrees. So if you have a bachelor's degree in the United States, you've already been socialized to a certain extent to know what's acceptable and what's not. That's right. I mean, that's a big part of getting a degree. Like, look, it's not all about what you've learned. It's about socialization, right?
Yeah.
So I don't care where you go to school. You went to HBCU, you didn't go to, along the way, you're getting trained how you should act in corporate America. So once you have agreed to that, you've already signed up for, I'm willing to go through what is required to get into corporate America, right? Or you have some other plan. Maybe you want to be an entrepreneur. That's fine, but you've kind of already signed up for some of this, right? Some of this, and now it's just a matter of degrees. We had a panel discussion a couple of months ago. It was actually at the end of Black History Month, and it was about maybe like 5 of our Black executives, and each one of them, when we were prepping them for the panel, each one of them asked me, "How real do you want me to be?" They all asked me that. Now that means that they have a myriad of situations. And then while they were on the panel, they kept looking at each other like, and you can tell they're thinking, do I want to tell this story exactly how it went down, or, you know, how do I? So, you know, as you move up the corporate ladder, you're always making a decision. How much of this am I willing to put up with? It's just a matter of degrees, right? Maybe there are some organizations where people, you know, but just being in corporate America, right? There are definitely limits to what you can do, what you can't do. I mean, you work at a company, right?
Yeah.
So everyone's doing it. What I notice is that, you know, as a Black American, I just may be doing it a little bit more because my experiences outside of work may be more different than the average person, right? There's a larger gap, but it's a matter of degree.
Yeah.
And what I'm willing to deal with.
You mentioned something interesting about the universities and what they prepare you for. And it seems like, let me just say, if you go on mute, the person speaking probably can't even hear me, but if you could go on mute, that would be great. So you talk a little bit about what universities prepare you for. And, you know, we've often heard from new grads coming in, and I remember myself, you know, you don't really get a class on professionalism. You don't get a class on how to navigate culture and what cultural fit means and the importance of it. Or if you get on the ride and you feel like you want to get off, like you may have went to all this schooling And, yes, we have a regimented, a structure here, there's the discourse here. But when you get in the real world, it's a lot different. It is very surprising to people sometimes. And so it reminds me of, Troy, what you said, and you shared with us as panelists before this call, that there have been times when you've been in the C-suite and conversations come up about candidates. And sometimes they are Black and brown candidates where the room doesn't quite know how to articulate what they don't like about that Black or brown person, that in your heart,
But I'm glad we're getting
as a
good.
professional would never have been said about maybe it's not the types of things that come up with white candidates, right? And so for you, I guess, as D&I professionals, how are you putting your diversity and inclusion agendas throughout your organizations?
So thank you so much for doing this.
You're hearing conversations, and a lot of weight is on your shoulders. And so how, Nicole, I will start with you. What's been your experience of pushing your D&I work across the organization, especially in this climate?
Okay. Yeah, so good question. So as I mentioned, been in the space for 18 months. The first several months was spent on doing a lot of benchmarking, but also developing our vision. And our vision is, to have a, diverse and inclusive culture that people could bring their whole selves to work and, have a sense. And I recently added and respects our differences, respects and celebrates our differences.
Yeah.
But, even at the beginning of COVID, we started having these conversations where I facilitate. We started off with being flexible with focus, working from home with kids and dogs during COVID. And shortly after the George Floyd murder, similar to other organizations, we started having different types of conversations, which I think has elevated, our D&I strategy at Navistar. And I know that I've had a lot of people come to me and talk about, well, how are you doing? Right? Because you have to navigate your own emotions as we're going through this and trying to do it in an effective way where we can institute change in our organizations. Right. So as we talk about how do we make it is a challenge, right? For those that have not been the underrepresented to really understand what needs to happen. Right. And I think sometimes we find it difficult as far as what is our expectations, right? There's a big difference between having a diverse organization and an inclusive organization, right? So you can have representation without having inclusion. So what is our expectation, I think, has been one of my challenges as we are establishing goals, because, absolutely, we need a better pipeline of diverse candidates. Absolutely, we do need that. Because if you don't have the diversity, it will be difficult to have inclusion. But let's say we bring all these diverse candidates on board, and then we don't make any changes to our organization, and I know Trey said we kind of sign something when we go to corporate America that this is how we're going to behave ourselves this way, right? That's why we're not entertainers. We're not, because we know that you have to follow, or you should be following whatever the culture is at your company. So I think it's important as you're trying to develop strategies in diversity and inclusion. What does your leadership, what is your CEO, what do they want your company? Obviously, you want to make great products and services, but what do you want the people to feel, right? What do you want the people in your organization to represent? Of course, there's subcultures throughout any organization, but as an overarching goal, what is it that you want to accomplish in your organization? And I feel like, obviously, number one for us is fairness, right? Equity, whether it's with employees or our suppliers, our customers, or communities. And I say this often, we just all need to be better human beings. And then we, and have some empathy, right? Empathy's been a popular topic these days about, understand that everyone's reality is not yours. So there's so much here, right? I appreciate that we're having this conversation about code switching specifically though, because it's, as the fake versus authentic, is it, and as I mentioned earlier, is it at what cost? Like if we continue to, because I speak this way whether I'm talking to you here or if I'm talking to my father who came to the door and the dog started barking, right? I speak the same. So at what point do we stop? It's like the stop, start, continue, or do we just say, is it limiting innovation? Like if we feel like we're code switching to the point where we're not performing at our best because we're leaving something that we could be adding additional value. Right. So I don't know. I think that as we're trying to push the agenda for diversity and inclusion, I'm looking at a question in the chat about, when a white CEO can't articulate their expectations, vision around DEI, you have to help them understand it, right? Well, you have to understand that's where surveys come in, data, right? Data drives decisions and, and action. So it is, it's a difficult thing to do, but I think that what we've been trying to do is just, I wouldn't say ease into it, because this is the time to kind of hit them in the face with it, right?
Yeah.
But,
so I know at Navistar, one thing that you've been doing, Nicole, and your team, your diverse team that you mentioned, has offered several different value-based discussions like this. We haven't had that before, your leadership. And so it's in this climate been so instrumental in terms of inclusion, because those voices have been elevated and leaders, with Donna's sponsorship, the leaders have joined those discussions. Yeah. Sometimes they talk, a lot of times they just listen, and many times that's all people want. None of us have the answers. And so I think at Navistar, you're right, you're working toward whatever the end in mind, post-racial looks like. Right now, we're building on inclusion, and these discussions just like this have been very instrumental at Navistar. We had not previously done a lot of this in the D&I space. So, all right, so let's go to Troy. With your work in D&I and your organization, a lot of weight on your shoulders, how do you cascade your vision? I guess, what types of things are you all working on doing? What strategic levers do you pull, et cetera?
All right, so we already had a D&I strategy that was in place for about the past 4 years. We established, like most companies, an inclusion leadership team, which was headed by our CEO and our head of HR. So we have a strategy in place that looks at inclusion, that looks at our diverse representation, supplier diversity, managing compliant risk. So there's a number of things that we're involved with. In terms of the levers we pull, I do want to mention a few ways that I'm calling it the summer of George Floyd, some of those things were tweaked. One, we were already working on a series of conversations like this. We call it Inclusion is How We Do Conversations. And those conversations could be on race or gender or sexual orientation. We were already planning that. And then when George Floyd was murdered, all of a sudden the whole company was 50 times more interested in it. And it was, and I will say, everything we were already doing all these things. So like we just added a competence around inclusion company-wide. And that competence does basically say that it embeds what Nicole said, that for us, inclusion is, it starts with building a diverse team. So diversity and inclusion go together. So we were doing all that work, but then when George Floyd was murdered, we just saw a lot more interest. So we worked very closely with our National Black Associates. They hosted a series of sessions to just help people to deal with what they were dealing with. And I will say, the thing I'm particularly proud of is that when we engaged in our local African-American resource group, it really allowed some safety for there was no exclusion. Anybody who was a part could be a part of it, but it ended up being mostly Black people being able to have some pretty honest conversations about what they needed, and that was really important.
Yeah.
We did a number of things we actually put out a number of trainings, which, you know, like I said, we were already doing it, but my goodness, I mean, the amount of people that wanted to be a part of it went up exponentially.
Wow.
The other thing I'd say is that we went through a leadership transition this summer. So our previous CEO was very supportive of D&I, but our new CEO, I would say, hit the ground running, right? And on his second day of working, he met directly with all of our Black associate leaders and really just listened to them and asked them what they wanted to see, and committed to a number of the things that they wanted to see. That, you know, it was the most that we had directly leaned into social justice, community-based supplier diversity issues. I mean, so it's interesting how, you know, I hate to use the word tragedy, by the way. I think of George Floyd as a murder. I think of a tragedy as something as like an accident. It's really close to me, and it makes me tremendously sad. But in the short term, what it has done that I think has been most powerful is we ended up having a lot of meetings. And I will say, we met with an executive, all of our executives met shortly after the death of George Floyd to talk about what are we going to do. And I have to say, the thing that was most encouraging is that the agenda was shaped by white men. And it's probably the first time that I've seen white men say, you know what? Like, actually, I'm thinking of one of our leaders that said, did any of you think this would have happened if that was a white man? Do you think he would have got choked out on national? That's the phrase he used. We just saw a man got murdered on national TV. Do any of you actually think this would have happened if that was a white man? And that leadership, where it actually, at our company, actually brought white men to more directly lead the work, was the most interesting thing that I've ever seen. So we're continuing that work, but you kind of started the question with the weight being on me. I mean, I think the way it's hopefully changed a little bit is it's been a little bit easier to have conversations with everybody about what we should be doing. And we've gotten help actualizing what our plan was.
Yeah, absolutely. So Meredith, I am going to come back to you on this answer. So you've got some more time to think. Let's now go to the chat, because we're in our last 17 minutes. And so I know they've got some good burning questions. So with that, Caitlin, can you give us a question from the chat?
Sure. So a question that was posed a little while ago is, what can you do, if anything, to help others, maybe those who are up and coming or new to a company or position, find their true voice or sense of self among having to navigate code switching? Is there anything you can do?
All right. So Meredith, can you lead us into answering this question?
Sure. So would you mind repeating it? I was caught up in the chat. I heard, is there anything they can do?
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks,
What can
Caitlin.
you do, if anything, to kind of help those who are new to a company or position that don't seem to have their voice heard, or feel like their voice is being heard, their true sense of self hasn't really come out yet among code switching? Is there anything you could do personally to help this individual?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it depends on what level you are, right? There's a lot that you can do. So if this person is a new employee reporting into you, creating that safe space and structure to, encourage them and just be your authentic self around them enables them to come out and be their authentic self. So it's either that's a boss manager dynamic, that's something that you can do. If you are a colleague and this is something that you observe and your company is fortunate enough to have employee resource groups, then, maybe approaching that person and just having our conversation, understanding more about, about them, sharing your experience at the company and kind of, the ins and outs and how you navigated. And then, oh, by the way, I'm part of this group and this has really helped me. Would love to have you join. That's something else you can do. Or simply just, taking this person out to lunch, right? Or, well, not in COVID times, but, a virtual coffee, right? Like just having a one-to-one conversation and getting to know someone and building that relationship can be really impactful. It doesn't have to be some huge grandiose move. But yeah, there's definitely something, just taking the time to listen and share your knowledge and share your time, it can really go a long way.
Thank you, Meredith. All right, so Nicole, how about you? What are your thoughts on developing new people as they come in the door in terms of being inclusive?
Yeah, I think one of the great things that we do with our with all our new hires is introduce them to our employee resource groups, right? So a part of your onboarding is, us telling new people about our 7 employee resource groups, right? I agree with obviously with everything that Meredith said. I think finding mentors, sponsors, those are good. But one thing I will say, and I know we were kind of, running up on time, but I do think that this generation, from a Gen Z standpoint, they're going to show up as they are anyway. So I think that this is, the time where is it code switching anymore, or are they just going to show up? This is who I am, right? And then the organizations need to change in some capacity because they're going to show up as they are.
Interesting.
So I think that it's a different conversation from a generation standpoint, in my opinion, of,
Yeah.
Newer people, because, and I saw that question in the chat too, because, someone up and coming or someone, early career, they're gonna say and do what they want anyway, right now. Like where I was taught to assimilate,
Yeah.
they're taught to stand out. So if standing out means to be themselves, then that's what's gonna happen.
Yeah, we talked about this conversation has so many different tentacles, and that's an interesting one you bring up. It's generational too. The young adults today, is it code switching to them? Maybe they have their own discourse. There's a way they show up. But I guess on that same thought, so Troy, I guess, what are your thoughts on what tip or tool would you offer up as new folks are walking through the door, people of color? How do you help them assimilate?
Yeah, so we actually, in the way we talk about inclusion, we actually define assimilation as a bad thing. Like we define assimilation as low value, which is it's not us taken from a model, as low value and uniqueness, high belonging. So look, we understand that happens to people. They feel the pressure of assimilation, but we actually we try to put the onus on our leaders to be inclusive, right? To engage the difference and figure out how they can include people, because at that point, they've already been hired, right? Like, I mean, they should have already passed every bar the company has around. So if your company has another set of bars, which we think our company does, but another set of informal bars, we'd say those informal bars are kind of not okay. Like, we got to figure out how we put more onus on the leadership team to be inclusive of that person's difference, because they've already been hired, right? They've already been hired, but we do some of the same things. We try to connect people with our resource groups. I try to personally meet candidates, especially candidates in leadership that are people of color, to kind of connect with them. But that's the main thing we do, is try to connect them early on with our resource groups.
Nice. Okay. And I think it's an interesting perspective that you offer. It was assimilation is low value on unique skills and high value on belonging, right? So that's an interesting perspective. Yeah. because we want people to bring their voices. That's the skill set many times by which we see them demonstrate the capabilities for which they were hired for. And so when people do not feel that they are able to demonstrate those capabilities in their way, they oftentimes, we struggle to retain them. They'll go somewhere else where they feel like they can find a place where they can color, where they can color. So anyway, Caitlin, let's go to another question in the chat. And I will say for panelists, we've got not that much longer left. So if we spend maybe just, less than a minute answering these questions. Caitlin, go ahead with the next one.
Sure. So this one, I think Meredith wrote back, but for the other panelists, do you happen to know if there are any studies or do you have any insight on maybe long-term impact that code switching has on individuals, whether that's psychological or otherwise?
All right, good question. Who would like to take that one? Any ideas on long-term impacts a person might experience by having to code switch?
I'm not aware of any. I'm just trying to think through it specifically about code switching. No.
Well, what
I know,
about
I think
you?
I saw this too, as far as the development thing where, if someone doesn't code switch, just kind of looking at if they don't code switch, what the impacts are on their career development. It would be an interesting study, but personally, I'm not aware of any.
Yeah, I think we can speak from our personal experiences. We don't have probably research data here, but I think trying to identify with who you really are becomes harder and harder, because if for whatever reason, person of color, otherwise, gender or otherwise, feels like they are trying to match up to something that they are not, a certain standard, if you will, for wherever their environment is, it must be exhausting, as someone mentioned. And I would imagine that there are long-term impacts, just like many of us have things that have happened in our background that none of us can really identify with, or when we show up to work, we don't know why a person acts the way they do. This is probably another piece of luggage that we pick up as part of our baggage throughout life. And so I would imagine there are some impacts. But does everyone get treated for those impacts psychologically? Probably not. Maybe not. So that's an interesting case study. Okay, Caitlin, what's the next question, please?
I think that the ones that I've posed or the ones that have been posed in the chat have been answered by one of the panelists. So I think that we are good unless somebody wants to chat one in right now.
I think, you know what, if someone's adding a question, fantastic. We've got 10 minutes left. But there was a question I thought Nicole mentioned about when you're CEO. What was that question about when you're CEO?
Oh, it was earlier on the chat. And actually, I don't know if your clock, we only got 4 minutes. According to
Oh, you know what? I'm so glad that my clock on my laptop, I have a call into the company IT right now. It's wrong.
I will say with the question, it was earlier on the chat. It was basically, if your CEO doesn't get it, what do you do? And Meredith, actually, she's been doing good managing this chat. But
Good.
I don't know if you want to verbally say what you put in the chat. That probably good.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. So great question. And thanks, Nicole. So just quickly, what I shared is, it can't be the onus of the diversity person or the ERG or you, right? If you identify as a person from an underrepresented group, to bring that CEO along, right? So you just have to understand, is their struggle because they're like curious and not really sure how to get started and just having kind of this epiphany and they care authentically? Or is it more like they don't get it, like they kind of really don't even believe, and this is kind of like some annoying thing that the board is bothering them on? Those are two different, dynamics. And so, in those instances, you show up differently, right? Like you have to make the decision if they don't believe some tactics that you're going to employ, including should you stay or should you go, personally in those instances, it's hard for me to do this work and stay. Um, you know, so and I was and I was just gonna say, and on the other hand, right, it's helping bring them along in the journey. So at LinkedIn we have a program called Bridge, in which we enable our senior executive predominantly white leaders to meet with a room full of over 35 underrepresented Black and Latino leaders that are in executive positions and have conversations about race. So we could diversify our networks and move in the journey together to create authentic change versus, you know, you can't read your way out of this work. You know, you can't just decide that you believe in it without really, you know, being exposed. And so it's really understanding where they are and trying to ensure that you're involving them in an inclusive manner, similar to the example that Troy gave earlier about the learning lab that he led at his company.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for that tip and those tools that you offered up from LinkedIn. I think what we can do right now in our last 2 minutes is hand it back to Donna Dorsey. So she's been our host for today and kicked us off. But Donna, I think this last question in a minute and to close us out would be yours. Is, you know, how can you assist the CEO to partner with you on this D&I journey?
Interesting journey as well, similar to Troy. We had a leadership transition, and I would agree that our prior CEO is actually the executive sponsor of our African American resource group. And I think it is our job to provide counsel, I'll use it that way, where you can get active engagement from all employees by having this conversation, because we have learned at Navistar, and many of you I hope have as well, that there are many allies within our organization who come together and who feel the pain in a different way, but still feel the pain. So my job is to make sure that I speak up, and my job is to make sure that I speak my truth and help him, in my case, see where we have to make strides in this space for us to succeed as a company. So it is a journey. It is not a, you know, it's not a destination that's clear right now, but it is definitely a journey. And I can tell you now that I feel that there's a lot of support, at least from my CEO, having signed the CEO Action Pledge and other things, working with Nicole. I think we're doing the right things. There's so much more to do.
All right. Thank you so much. With that, I know that we are out of time. And so in AAA HR, if there is nothing from you, I think we can go ahead and ask people to just have a great day. And thank
One last thing.
Okay.
One quick thing, like it'd be 30 seconds. First and foremost, hello everyone, my name is Eric B. Horn. I'm the VP of Branding for NAAA HR Chicago. And I wanted to say on behalf of NAAA HR Chicago, to the panelists and everyone that participated, thank you so much for your time, your effort, and energy. The topic of code switching is a very hot topic because this is the highest engagement and participant event that people have participated in for the entire year. So I think Denise Smith said something on other spinoff topics. So we'll definitely in the future have other topics with regards to code switching. And I have one quick announcement. So our next event, which is September 24th at 5:30 p.m. to celebrate HR Professionals Day, we are having a virtual happy hour. So I know everyone is probably zoomed out with meetings and things of that nature, but this happy hour is to celebrate HR professionals. However, this is an event specifically for NAAA HR members. So if you are currently not a member, you still have time to join. If you had any other questions, comments, concerns based off of joining, you can send us an email at info@NAAAHRchicago.org. Thank you again for your time. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Marius.